My name is Noelle Norton, and I am the Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences. And welcome to USD Conversations. This is our new weekly series featuring faculty, alumni, and all our friends who share their insights around current events and very timely themes. It is hosted by the College of Arts and Sciences and the USD Humanities Center, and this is our second. We'll have a third next week, so tune in then as well. Today's topic is social relationships in times of social distancing. We have guest speakers, Bradley Bond and Jonathan Bowman. Social distancing is a term we all know well now. It's become part of our common language in the current age of COVID-19. CDC guidelines suggest that we stay 6 feet apart from others, shelter in place, and avoid interpersonal contact without facial coverings. So in the next hour, our two speakers are going to offer us some thoughts on how social distancing is affecting our relationships, from our real life friends and coworkers to our favorite television characters and celebrities as well. Dr. Bradley Bond is the chair and associate professor in the Department of Communication Studies. His research focuses on how our exposure to media impacts our gender, sex, and sexual identity. Dr. Jonathan Bowman is a professor in the Department of Communication Studies as well. Dr. Bowman's current research focuses on the study of intimacy and close relationships. So I want to thank both of them for being here. I can't wait until I see them in person again, but I'm happy they're here with us now. I'm going to, at this point, turn it over to our moderator, Tanya Albin, who will be facilitating this discussion. So welcome and enjoy.
I'd like to start out by asking Jonathan, what kinds of observations have you made over the past month or so that impact our interpersonal relationships?
Yeah, so I think one of the big things that everyone's talking about right now is the fact that the people they live with are driving them crazy. And I think a lot of people feel really guilty about that. And I don't think people need to. So I guess I kind of want to talk a little bit about that first. If you've ever gone on a vacation, a road trip with a good friend or a romantic partner, you've known them 10 years, 20 years, maybe you're even married to them. One of the things you may realize is that by the end of that road trip, you find yourself really looking forward to some time alone. Maybe your best friend is like temporarily not your best friend anymore. So, it usually only lasts a little bit of time, but if you think about it, each of us in our own private houses is on the longest road trip we've ever been on, with the people that we, at least at one point, loved. So I just want to say, it's totally fine to feel that way about the people that we know and love. And, there's a couple of reasons that communication scholarship would say it makes sense why we feel that way. I think one of the first things is, with the COVID-19 crisis, there's so much uncertainty. And one of the, main theories that we have in our discipline, one of the earliest theories in our discipline was uncertainty reduction theory. And it talks about how we just don't feel great when we have uncertainty, when we don't know and aren't able to predict what's going on in the situation. So the world outside our homes is probably, is definitely filled with a lot of that uncertainty. And there may even be uncertainty within our own homes as well. And so I think what's happening for a lot of people is we are reacting to that uncertainty, and we're kind of projecting that onto our families. And I think you see that in two different ways. I think for some people, that uncertainty is manifested in over communication. So if you have that family member that the first thing they do in the morning is tell you, the updated statistics on how COVID-19 is affecting the world. I know someone who says that they talk to their mom, and their mom, the first thing they say in the morning is just the death statistics over the past day. So these are not pleasant ways to start the day. These are also normal coping strategies where people are really trying to engage one another and really trying to talk it out. At the same time, in your own family, or maybe you yourself or your romantic partner, whoever does this with you there, some people are just so overwhelmed by the uncertainty that they're actually going into that fight or flight response, and they're really retreating from conversation. So preteen that's normally really bubbly might have suddenly seemed to turn 14 overnight, running in their room and shutting the door the second that they see you. And part of that is just there's a lot going on. There's so much going on, and each person is handling the response to this differently. So what that means is that you can't have a consistent way to respond to the people that are struggling around you, right? Some of you have people who are pushing away. Other people have people that are just clinging so much. And we just have to cut everyone some slack. And I'd say we also have to really cut ourselves some slack as well. I think that's probably the most important thing, is realizing like our nerves may be at the end, and they're just, we're ready for something to change. And sometimes we create our own problems or concerns in our own life just to make some sort of change. So I think that's one of the big things, is the uncertainty that people are facing. I think one of the other reasons why it's okay that the people that we love or the people that we live with, because those aren't always the same things. I know many of you have roommates out there and you're just like, oh my gosh, like, so in those kinds of situations, it's important to remember that like we're learning a lot about the people in our lives that we did not know before. Stuff that we didn't necessarily even want to know before. I was looking over CNN.com a couple days ago, just looking for something to distract me. And I came across an article that made me really just start giggling alone in my house. It was Jada Pinkett Smith was talking about how she doesn't even know her husband, Will Smith. And that's the one thing she's discovered during the COVID-19 crisis. And I laughed really hard because that's everyone right now. Like everyone is discovering stuff that they didn't know about their roommate, their family member, their romantic partner. And that's in part because for some people, they have so much time on their hand that they're finally giving undivided attention to the people that they spend time with. And that can be really unusual. I did a research project not too long ago with Roger Pace, who's also in communication studies with Brad and I. And one of the things we were looking at is multitasking. And we were finding out that, of course, the task you're working on is negatively impacted when you're multitasking. But if the other task is communicative in nature, we found that it actually hurts the communication. So your communication isn't as good when you're distracted by other stuff. And for some families right now, you are not distracted by anything. There is nothing going on. You don't have the errands that you wish you could so desperately run. And so for those people, talking becomes one of the few things that you can do consistently. And oftentimes, that talking may happen during something else, but usually the attention is much more on a family member, a kid, a roommate, a romantic partner, in a way that it may not have been before. And so, that's causing people to learn stuff out about the people that they live with and love or don't love. And I think that that's causing us to like really reevaluate the people that we live with. Not because we don't like them less or more, but just because we're realizing we didn't know them in the ways that we thought we did. And I'm gonna let Brad have a word in Edgewise in a second, but I just want to say it's totally okay. In fact, it's expected that you have parts of you that other people don't know. Like that's a normal, healthy part of our psychology. Part of the ways that our relationships deepen with each other over time is that we continually reveal more and more stuff about ourselves to our friends, our family, our loved ones, our close coworkers. So we would expect that over time, you're gonna slowly have more and more to reveal. And you don't want to be a completely open book in an unhealthy way right off the bat. But we are learning so much more about people during this short period of time. And I should give a quick caveat. I know I've talked to some of my friends up in Northern California, people that procreated more than I expected them to. And they're describing situations right now where they have many children being homeschooled. And to me, as someone without kids, like 2 or more is many. But these are like 3 or 4 kids. And they're all being homeschooled where normally they would be in school. And so for those people, they aren't having any time alone or to think about, like they're trying to work their own job, their partner's working their job, they're trying to teach 4 different independent curricula to their kids, while also cooking, cleaning, managing everything, and then dealing with their own personal psychosocial relationships and mental health as well. So you know, just like I said before, where people are all over the map in terms of their kind of experiences during the coronavirus crisis, people are also all over the map in terms of how much they can interact and engage in deep, meaningful ways with one another. So I think many people are discovering like, oh my gosh, this isn't the person I'm living or I plan to be living with. On the one hand, that's cool. That means you're learning a lot more about that person. And you're also learning more things that you can grow to love about that person. May take a while for some of those intense fandoms, but yeah, I guess that's kind of my primer to what's going on during all this stuff that's going on.
Thank you. Yeah, I've heard in the news that the divorce rates are going up quite significantly.
Yeah.
And then on the other hand, some people are getting closer too. So that makes sense. You're definitely you're getting to know that person on another level.
Totally. Yeah. And, you know, sometimes it's even just like problems that may have been already latent under the relationship that have been there forever, that would have just taken years of interaction to finally come to a head. Those years of interaction are being compressed into like 6 weeks. So, you know, for some people, this is a great kick in the rear end to get them to start addressing concerns in their relationships with their partner. There are lots of great online counseling services that are available that you can do with your partner even during the crisis if you want to. But for some people, I think they're pulling the trigger on something they had already made up their mind about a long time ago, and we're just kind of waiting a few years to get to that point.
I have a question for those who live alone. Do you have any tips for them? I know, you know, it's very stressful for them as well.
Yeah. So the first thing, she just walked up to me. First thing, go get a pet, right? Oh, Nala does not like being on Zoom. She is not happy right now. This is my dog, Nala. She is a shelter dog, and she's the best thing in the world. She's not a thing. She's a dog. She's the best dog in the world. And I absolutely love that I have her. So, you know, to some degree, like as an aside, before I actually answer your question, like go help clean out a shelter. Like there's plenty of opportunities out there. If there's someone you know that can't take care of a pet, offer to take care of their pet. There's lots of fostering, et cetera. But I'm gonna stop that part of my response. But the one thing I would say is, you know, for people that are living alone, one of the big concerns is like affection and how people are receiving affection. And I teach in my nonverbal communication classes this interesting finding that we have about touch. So we know that touch is super important. So there's early research studies about like the importance of touch in early childhood development and growing mental synapses early on in your brain in order to be able to fully understand and engage your world. But we also find that there are ways that people have coped with trying to make up for not having that touch. And the first thing that really drew my attention to this was the finding that some scholars are saying that perhaps listening to music with that really heavy bass line turned up pretty loud is actually mimicking physical affection in some way. So the compression of air in the bass line of a song, you know, typically causes like the room to shake. It causes your like bottles that are closed to kind of change shape a little bit. It also changes the air pressure in your lungs slightly. And so that bass line, they're finding actually may mimic some of the small physical experiences you have of being hugged. And so one of the things that I think is super funny is that like we've been talking about the idea that people might have been using that as kind of an alternate way without knowing it of receiving affection, right? So like listening to music with heavy bass lines make people feel good. So maybe one of the things that we could do is, you know, just by playing, I'm saying this now knowing that people living in an apartment are going to make their neighbors hate them, but playing music louder with that heavy bass line. And, you know, if it's just in your ears, that's not going to mimic that as much. So maybe you go out and you sit in your car and you put it in, you don't turn it on because we're saving the environment, but you put it in an accessory mode and you just play some bass for a little bit away from people. And that could mimic that feeling as well. And then more practically for a lot of us, fuzzy blankets. I know it sounds super silly, but like fuzzy so fuzzy or like tactile, comfortable, like terry cloth kinds of clothing like anything that feels, as weird as it sounds, anything that feels like an animal or a pet or something like that, can make you feel more comfortable as well. So if you really need it, you can put on a fuzzy blanket and then layer a few other blankets or a pile of clothes, your clean laundry on top of you. And that can almost mimic that compression feeling of just being warm and safe. You know, as I say that, I realize when I do my laundry, I put it on my bed and then I cover my dog in all the laundry, and she loves the warm, hot laundry, and she just lays there. And then usually that means that I have to do another load of laundry more quickly because it's all just covered in dog. But at the same time, like, we can do that kind of stuff with ourselves, right? Like, we can minister to or heal ourselves by giving ourselves those opportunities to kind of feel loved, like soft clothes, soft blankets, heaviness, weight on us, even taking a bath, like those kinds of things can work really well to mimic that affection that's lost. It's no substitution for a good shelter animal, but it's still a close second.
That's very interesting. I haven't heard of that before. Due to this current situation, we're having to Zoom our loved ones even more so, or frankly, I don't know if I've done that before. So how do we make sure that they feel loved over
Yeah.
Zoom?
So one of the funny things about using technology to interact with the people that we love is that sometimes it can backfire and it can have the exact opposite effect. And so, like, as silly as it sounds, the best ways that we can make someone feel loved is by turning off all of the devices, getting rid of all of the distractions, and paying attention to those people. So the best way to show them that you are paying attention to them, if you have Zoom or FaceTime or Skype or any of these video chat services, is by the direct eye contact. And so the way that I recommend doing that, whether it's your phone, whether it's your laptop, you know, what iPad, whatever you're doing, wherever the microphone is, I recommend putting, this is gonna sound so silly and you're gonna think this is so infantile, but putting like 2 eyeballs, one on either side of the camera. Now you can put, you can cut out 2 little circles of the sticky part of sticky notes and put it right next to the Zoom camera. I do that sometimes, and that can really help you make eye contact. In fact, right now I have just 2 pieces of paper from the post office that I've stuck on either side of that, and I'm pretending like those are eyeballs. And that makes me make sure that I'm talking to you rather than looking at myself on the screen, looking at my phone, looking at my water bottle, right? So there's so many different things that we can do there to really make sure that the person feels like we're making the eye contact with them that we really would hope that we would. So I think that's, you know, getting rid of distractions and then demonstrating to the other person that you're not distracted are probably the 2 best ways to make that happen.
Nice. I'll have to try that next time.
Yeah, it sounds super silly and, like I said, really infantile, but you'd be amazed at how much you make eye contact with those eyeballs. And so, you know, on your cell phone, just like put a couple little dots, right? I mean, they don't have to look like eyeballs. These 2 postage stamp things, you know, like, they don't look like eyeballs. I used to use eyeballs, but I don't necessarily do it anymore. But just simply by putting that up there, it helps so much.
Nice. Thank you. So we've heard about how COVID-19 is affecting our interpersonal relationships. How is it affecting our parasocial relationships? Brad.
I think someone needs to unmute Brad first.
There we go. Okay. Yeah, thanks. So what's really interesting to me is that so much of what Jonathan just talked about maps completely onto the research that I do, even though Jonathan and I would probably call ourselves communication scholars that fit in different subdisciplines of our field. And that's because a lot of what we know about our interpersonal relationships has been used to explain our connections to media characters. And so I was really excited to have this talk with Jonathan because of his expertise in our relationships that we have with interpersonal others and the way that that maps onto our media relationship. So we're all sheltering in place. We're all spending significantly more time at home, as Jonathan mentioned, and significantly less time with the people that that we care about, with our loved ones, with people who are not in our household. In turn, many of us are spending significantly more time with the media. We are catching up. I mean, I certainly have caught up on my Netflix programming. We're watching a lot more television. We're engaging in social media significantly more than we normally do. And what I find particularly fascinating about that is the fact that those experiences with media are often motivated and maintained by the relationships that we develop with characters and celebrities. So one of the things that I study is a concept that we refer to as parasocial relationships. And our parasocial relationships, briefly defined, are these social emotional connections that we have with individuals who we do not know in real life. So the defining characteristic of these relationships is that they're one-sided, right? They lack mutuality. So you may have a really strong connection to a fictional character, and if that character is fictional, obviously, you know, the character doesn't also have a relationship with you, but you feel like you know that character. You're happy when they're happy. You're sad when they're sad. You would invite them to your birthday party if you could. I had a participant in an interview study recently. I thought this was a great example, talking about Liz Lemon, which was a fictional character on NBC's television show 30 Rock. And when Liz Lemon became engaged on the show, the research informant mentioned how for like the next 3 days, she thought about what she would buy Liz Lemon as a wedding gift if she was invited to her wedding. And it's a really good example of this idea that like we create these connections. And the reason for creating these connections is really based in evolutionary psychology. And that's simply that it is human nature for us to establish relationships with other people. It's how we survive as a species, and that we need to have these kind of connections with others. The idea that we have connections with people on screen isn't all that surprising. In fact, when we look at neuroscience research, the way that we engage with the television screen is really quite similar to the way that we engage with real life experiences. Obviously, your brain is capable of knowing the difference between, you know, a scene in a television show and something that you see happening outside of your window, but we rarely actually use the cognitive effort to make that difference. So when we're watching people on screen, our brain is often processing them as if we're engaging with them in real life. So research suggests that we develop first impressions of people on screen the same way we do as real life others, that we maintain those relationships in similar ways, that they dissolve in similar ways, that we overcome conflict in those relationships in very similar ways. So for spending more time at home and more time with the screen, one of the things that I'm really fascinated by and currently collecting data on is the idea that if we're spending less time with our social friends and more time with our media friends, is that altering our perceptions of either group, right? Are we becoming closer to the people that we see on screen? Are we perceiving them as more similar to our real life friends than we would in a typical situation? It's worth noting when I talk about this in class or at talks, I often ask people to think about, right, a fictional character that you might have a parasocial relationship with, right? Somebody that you feel close to, but that you've certainly never met and may not even exist if they're a fictional character. And people are sometimes hesitant to share that with me. And I think that there's this perception that having really strong connections to a fictional character would be like pathological, that there's something there's something psychosis about that like, I don't know if that says anything about my mental well-being. And a vast majority of research suggests that these are healthy connections. Most of us have really healthy connections to characters just as we do with real life others. And that's only a very small percentage, much like our interactions with real life other people, who have these kind of connections at an unhealthy level to media characters. And it's typically easily explained by psychological diagnoses that would explain hindrances in real life relationships as well. So the mimicking of our relationships with our characters to our real life friendships is really quite astonishing. And so if we're stuck at home, you know, are we developing those connections in ways that we never have before? Are our media friends taking the place of our real life friends? And research for decades has shown that that is not the case. It was originally thought that people who might be really lonely and not have strong relationships develop really strong parasocial relationships, which is logical, right? If you don't have a lot of real life friends, maybe you're making up for that with friends on the screen. But studies have actually shown it's the opposite way around, that if people who are really extroverted, people who are social butterflies, people who make friends really easily in real life, also make really strong parasocial connections, which also really makes sense, because the idea that, you have the psychological toolkit needed to make friends easily, then you also make friends on screen easily. So I'm really fascinated by how the pandemic might be shifting that, or might be challenging the, challenging the things that we know about our relationships with characters.
Do you think after this quarantine is over and we start going out with our real life friends, do you think our connections with fictional characters or celebrities weaken?
Good question. I would argue, at least, that is unlikely, based on what we know about our relationship development, right? So our parasocial relationships, if they are strengthening, right, if these connections to fictional characters and celebrities are becoming stronger because we're spending more time with screens, then it's unlikely that would weaken because we're engaging in new activities. So, for example, Jonathan mentioned uncertainty reduction, or uncertainty as it relates to relationships. It's a classic theory in the interpersonal literature and in communication generally. And if we are becoming more certain of our relationships with characters because we have more exposure to them, then we build that psychological connection, and simply increasing our social network, right, or engaging in people in different ways in our real life connections wouldn't necessarily weaken those connections. Another kind of classic interpersonal theory that we would teach in any introductory communication class is social penetration theory, which is very similar in that the more that we get to know someone, the more information that becomes more personal that we know about somebody else, the more we can forecast and predict that relationship, the stronger we feel to that individual. And that's the nature of a television narrative, right? That like over time, we learn more about that particular character. So if you're engaging in more television exposure, then you're likely learning a lot more about that character, and in turn starting to build that relationship. You find things that you identify with them with. You find ways in which you have, excuse me, wow, in which you find similarities, and those connections build. I'll let you ask the question so I can take it.
We have a question from the audience, actually. Someone asked, do we anticipate any of these communication changes to be permanent once we are back to normal?
Jonathan, what do you think? I would say that it's really difficult to define back to normal. Like, what will that mean for us? I'm not sure what that means. Jonathan, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, so, I think that we always get stuck on this idea of what's normal. And I think that, for example, older people tend to look at today's youth and talk about how they don't communicate normally. And I think what we actually see is that new communication technologies enter the world and communication changes, and that just becomes the new normal. And so I think that probably the COVID-19 pandemic is probably just ushering in a new normal. And I think there'll be benefits to that, and I think there'll be drawbacks to that. I think that we may see some right sizing of interpersonal relationships, meaning that, you won't be focusing on trying to maintain 1,000 people that you're close with on a social media site, but instead you're focusing on the people that you're stuck with. And then we also might see that the ways that we use technology and the ways we use face-to-face and our comfort with self-disclosure may change. So self-disclosure is the term that Brad was talking about that when he was talking about social penetration theory, which is just revealing personal information about yourself. The more we get used to engaging in self-disclosive communication, maybe the more fluent we'll be. And so maybe people will have the ability to go a little deeper in some of their relationships in the future. I mean, we don't know, but in terms of will we get back to normal, I think that normal has shifted no matter what, right? So I think we'll get back to something that looks more like what we used to know. But in terms of will it be what we used to know a year ago versus 10 years ago versus 50 years ago, like no idea. We have I mean, obviously we're not going to change to an 18th century style of communication just because of a little bit of disruption in our lives. But at the same time, I don't think we're looking at, necessarily being at the 2050 style of communication as well. So I guess I would say we're curious. And I guess that's probably the best attitude to take, is like, hey, let's wait and see, roll with it, and then try and be as authentic to our own goals and desires as we can.
Yeah, I think that one of the things that's interesting there for me is that if we are starting to develop our relationships with others who are real life others, primarily through the screen, certainly for at least the last 10 years, we have been maintaining relationships through things like social media. But now, right, like my friends and I have our Zoom sessions where we have Zoom happy hour, we play some game where we can share a screen. And the only time that I engage with my friends is through Zoom, through my screen, right? So if I'm starting to develop and maintaining, right, my real life social relationships via screens, I'm particularly fascinated by what that means for our relationships that will stay on screen even when this is over, right? Our relationships with characters and celebrities. So now the people we do know in our real life, we can only maintain those relationships via a screen. And certainly that's different, right? And one of the terms that we use a lot when we're talking about technology is social presence. And social presence is this idea that when we're engaging with one another, in real life, that there are a lot of things that influence our interpretation of and our encoding of that communication behavior, right? That nonverbals, the smell of the room, the temperature of the room, the feel, the touch, literally everything influences how we communicate a message and how we interpret that particular message. I tell my students all the time that just being in a classroom really, really alters the way that you think about our relationship compared to me sitting in my home disclosing what my living room looks like to you, right? Like those are very different situations for our teacher-student relationship. And it's all happening on screen now. And so I'm really intrigued to see like if using the screen where we're lacking certain aspects of social presence to keep up with our real life others is altering the way that we think about our mediated ties as well. Because I mean, there's no difference between looking at Jonathan and looking at my favorite YouTuber, right? They're both talking at me from like waist up directly to the screen from a headshot. And it's a very similar pattern of disclosure. And I'm fascinated by how that might influence both of those ties.
Speaking of YouTubers, that seems to be very popular with young kids. Is there a reason for that?
YouTube is a really interesting venue to study with regards to our relationships and our connections to characters or celebrities. In this case, we would actually refer to YouTubers who have large followings as micro celebrities. It's a term that we use oftentimes in the literature. And YouTube is a fascinating channel to study, primarily because of the authenticity. So typically when we're watching YouTube videos, we tend to assign YouTubers a really high level of authenticity because they lack certain aspects of professionalism that you might see if you were watching, the Kardashians or some other reality television show where they're still talking into the screen or they're using social media to talk directly to you. But a YouTuber oftentimes is filming a video in a similar situation to what Jonathan, Tanya, and I are doing, right? Their living room is in the background, their cat pops into the image, they're talking directly to you, and they're self-disclosing personal information. Okay, it's a classic method of developing authenticity and trust with your audience, that you tell them what's happening in your day at personal levels that celebrities typically don't disclose. So that level of authenticity that's developed really maintains that need for information from people who are on YouTube. And so we're finding younger people, particularly as you mentioned, right, that children tend to turn to YouTube arguably because of that level of authenticity, right? These people are just like me. The other aspect of that is that, many of us have a desire for celebrity, and that the idea that you would become a famous movie star is both valued in our culture and also fairly rare, right? You're probably more likely to be struck by lightning than to star in the next blockbuster. But the opportunity that you might have to become YouTube famous is significantly higher because the perception is that anybody can do that, right? YouTube originally started with the slogan, broadcast yourself. The idea being that the average everyday person would be able to self-disclose in a mass communication fashion. And so it's both that level of authenticity and that level of attainability that tends to make YouTube a really popular medium for young people to develop these kind of connections.
Thank you. I want to interject with a question from Tiffany. Dr. Bond or Dr. Bowman, do you have any advice how to continue to build social capital and personal connections when there are less nonverbal cues available, as well as feeling of uncertainty and distrust during this time? Thank you.
Ooh, that's interesting. So one of the things I was thinking about when Brad was talking about YouTube kind of relates here. We have this concept called the hyper-personal perspective in communication. And it's the idea that as we limit the channels that are available to people, then we can not have to focus on monitoring our own behaviors in those situations. And as a result, we can present ourselves a little bit more positively. So to some degree, you could make the argument that kind of the mediated ways that we have to communicate with one another do give us that chance to kind of not be 100% on completely with all of ourselves in that situation. Now, the drawback of the hyper-personal perspective, obviously, is that you then develop a closer relationship with someone in that mediated format than you otherwise might if they were face-to-face. And so, you know, we can think of plenty of situations where that might not be desirable or might not be useful. But I don't know, I guess that's kind of the first thing that comes to mind with that question, is the idea that the medium itself may allow us to more carefully craft or construct our image. You know, the big question there would be like, are you trying to form these relationships synchronously, like in the same time with one another, or are you doing them asynchronously, right? Because if I can pre-record a message and then have that influence your attitude towards me, you have no idea how many takes I took before I got that right? And that same thing with those YouTube micro celebrities, right? Like, they are so authentic and they are so real, but they still might have taken 25 takes to present that authentic sense of self, right? So they're being their authentic sense of self, but also their carefully curated sense of self as well. So I guess part of it has to do with how much we're curating our own self when we're trying to engage other people. I mean, just getting ready for this right now today, like, I made sure that the top half of my body was presentable, right? Like, I'm wearing the same shorts that I'll probably go to sleep in tonight because they're super comfortable, but you can't tell that except for the fact that I just told you, which was probably also unprofessional. But, you know, like, that kind of stuff is, it can impact the way that we engage one another. I don't know, Brad, do you have any thoughts?
No, not beyond that. I think that you really kind of hit the nail on the head. I'm intrigued by her use of the term social capital in her question, because that's a really interesting concept to think about in today's day and age. And certainly the way in which we've built social capital, which we tend to think of as the human resources that we can use to further our place in society, right? So, like, if you've ever had somebody ask you to write you a letter of recommendation, the person who wrote that letter of recommendation is probably part of your social capital. Like, people who have the ability to help you maintain or develop your status in society or in your community or culture. And we have, in the last 10 years, we've actually moved a lot of our understanding of social capital, or at least the visibility of our social capital, online anyway. So things like LinkedIn, for example. LinkedIn is basically a social network to allow you to maintain and strengthen your social capital. That's kind of the idea, right? It's a professional social network based on social capital. So I would argue that taking advantage of, as Jonathan also said, carefully curating yourself and creating that particular image in an authentic fashion on those kind of websites would be useful for social capital purposes. Personal connection, more complicated, I would argue, and I think that Jonathan did a good job of touching on it.
I have another question about living alone. People think that because they live alone and because you live alone, that you should be going through this together. How do you deal with someone, especially a good friend, who is clingy and needs attention, but It's not the attention you can give.
Ooh, that's such a hard and loaded question. There's a couple different things you have to ask yourself before you even start to think about an answer to that. Like, one is the relationship good for me and for them, right? Like, sometimes we have relationships that it's not important for both people. Like, there's codependency or dependency that may not be healthy for both people. So I'd kind of, first of all, maybe encourage you to think through, like, is this a good relationship for us in the first place? Like, is this contributing to a neutral or to a positive mental health for both parties, right? Like, that's kind of the initial question. But then, like, if it's important to you, if it fits in with kind of your sense of self and or a sense of obligation or duty or history, or, you know, any of those kinds of things that really impact our attraction to or our obligation to other people, then I think it really comes down to cutting people the slack that we talked about at the beginning of our time together. Like, everyone is going a little bonkers right now. And some people display that in a variety of different ways. My house is always pretty clean, but it's obsessively clean right now. And I'm cooking way more than a human should possibly cook. And that's just kind of my way of dealing with it. But I think for some people, it is that desperate, it's not desperate, but that seemingly desperate desire for attention or affirmation or affection from another person. And that can be challenging, that can seem clingy. And, you know, in the short term, I think trying to just get through it, like allot yourself, like, the amount of time that you're willing to give to that person, and then kind of saying, like, no matter what happens during this time, that's okay. And I can move forward with offering that person that time. Offering that kind of extra grace during these times might be a helpful response, maybe more so than normal, because I think that in certain attachment, there's a whole perspective called attachment theory that we don't need to get into right now, but in times of stress, in times of crisis, well, apparently I'm going to get into it. In times of stress, in times of crisis, like, there's lots of different natural reactions that people have towards their interpersonal relationships in their life. Sometimes it's pushing people away. Sometimes it's drawing people close. Sometimes it's clinging desperately onto people. And sometimes it's just avoiding or ghosting on people. And I think that you can have a healthy, normal relationship with someone a lot of the time. And then in times of extreme stress, we see those kind of extreme behaviors. Usually those are temporary, you know, during the times of stress. And so, you know, maybe you have a great, healthy relationship with this person, and it will hopefully return to that at some point in the future. And right now, both parties need to kind of have a little give and take in what's acceptable and what's expected.
B. Miller brings up an interesting topic. He writes, can we talk about the anxiety around re-engaging face-to-face interactions with loved ones and how that will look and feel when we are allowed to take those steps?
So there's a couple different answers I would give depending on what the type of anxiety is that we're talking about. I mean, for one, there's the purely medical anxiety, right? So I think I'm not sick, and I don't imagine I'm sick, but I'm scared to see an older or an ill loved one because I'm worried I might be contagious still and still engage them, right? Like that's kind of the medical anxiety. I think the more interpersonal or communicative anxiety is around, like, what if things aren't like they used to be, right? Or what if it feels like we lost our relationship with one another? Or what if, you know, things just, like, aren't, there's nothing there, right? So I have a dear friend here in San Diego. He and his fiance were just weeks away from getting married. She went home to visit her family. COVID broke out. They've been apart from one another. They had to postpone their wedding until next April. I mean, it's all these shenanigans. They're fine. They're solid. They're great. But I can imagine many people in that situation, you're coming up on what's supposed to be the best event of your life, but also during the most stressful period, during a stressful pandemic experience. It would make sense for people to say, like, oh my gosh, like, are we going to have the same relationship that we had before the coronavirus? And, you know, I think maintaining relationships in whatever way we're comfortable with during the crisis, and then trying to re-engage those people in an acceptable and comfortable way is just going to be an act of faith, right? I think you're just going to have to try it out and see what happens. If you've ever, this is such a dumb example, if you've ever reached out to an ex, or you've seen a friend that you were estranged from for a while, and you come together and it's super awkward for like 5 minutes, and then 20 minutes later, everything's fine, and it's just like back when you were still normal friends. I think that's probably going to be what happens for most people who are nervous about those reunions. So I'd kind of just hope people would reflect on one of those positive communication re-engagements, and just hope that that's the framework for how it's going to work moving forward. I don't know.
I think that your earlier when you talked about uncertainty, I think that frames this question as well, right? That there's this level of uncertainty about what will happen. And this is not from scientific evidence, this is from an N of one, but in my own personal experience, even, FaceTiming with my family back in the Midwest, having conversations with my friend via Zoom, doing these things online in which the people that I have relationships with engage in typical behavior, right? And then that becomes reassuring, right? Like, nothing's changed. My mother is still going to bring up X, Y, and Z in our conversation. And that reduces that level of uncertainty for me about how that engagement will look when it's face-to-face, because even in an online setting, right, we're still in the mother-son relationship we've always had. My friends and I still have the relationship that we've always had. So I think that that idea of uncertainty causing, emotional distress also really speaks to this idea of what it will be like when we are face-to-face with our loved ones.
Do you think our connections to celebrities or fictional characters can help us out with our interpersonal relationships, or just be positive during this time?
Yeah, absolutely. I would say that, we typically develop our parasocial connections to individuals with whom we have affection for. There is some research that shows we develop negative parasocial relationships, that, you might actually tune into a television show because there's somebody that you despise, and you want to ensure that something bad happens to that individual. And so in turn, you kind of develop this enemy relationship. Certainly we have people that we dislike in our real lives, likely. And the idea is that we may also emotionally develop those same connections to characters. But a vast majority of the parasocial literature is about our positive connections to people that we see on screen. And I do think that those connections can certainly be helpful, right? That we can have those emotional moments that are useful for our own well-being with characters on screen. We can, you need to let out a good cry. Sometimes you even watch a movie that is going to make you cry. And there are a lot of theories that I also don't need to get into there from the kind of social psychology and communication standpoint as to like why we maintain a particular mood, or why we try to make ourselves reach what we call mood homeostasis, and that is like get back into a good mood. And media have the ability to do that for us, right? Like Jonathan had mentioned, like people who talk about the death toll as soon as they wake up, or the constant kind of negativity that we're getting as the world seems to be falling apart around us, that media can provide us with that escape, right? And in fact, one of the primary motivations of using media has traditionally been escapism, that it is a moment in time where you can escape your life and your real world problems and your real world trials and tribulations and live in the moment of someone else. And so would not be surprising to me that people would be using those media narratives as a way to kind of escape the world that we're all currently living in, because it's an anxiety causing situation. And so it's an easy way for us to kind of escape that and to feel better about ourselves and to have a moment of reprieve really from that. And when that reprieve comes from characters with whom we have these connections, right, then it becomes even more meaningful, arguably. It's like, I actually had a research participant recently say that, watching an old episode of a show that he's seen 100 times is like having coffee with an old friend. Because actually, in terms of uncertainty, there is no uncertainty there, right? You've seen the episode 100 times, you know what happens to the character, but you have this strong connection to them, and it becomes comforting. It's a comforting way to feel that connection with someone without the anxiety and the stress of what's happening in the room.
I think we have time for one more question from the audience. This one is from Katie. I work for a nonprofit that provides accessible outdoor recreation for people with disabilities. Any ideas from Jonathan or Brad to encourage stable online relationships for people with special needs?
I'd say probably one of the first things to think of is what the special needs entail and how best to engage that. I know for some people, using Zoom or FaceTime, like just the idea that you are broadcasting your face is distressing, right? I mean, it's a lot to manage. So for some people, it may be just choosing the right technology to have that conversation. I know in times of stress, we may all have our own kind of desires for different channels of communication. So it could simply be like knowing the needs of the people that you're engaging with, maybe have a phone call with them. For some people, if they're hard of hearing, maybe it has to be Zoom because the ability to read lips is super important, or FaceTime, or some communication technology in that way. So I'd say that's probably the first thing I think of. And then I'd also think about just communication apprehension in general, like talking to each individual. Would they prefer a group conversation? Would they prefer one-on-one? Would they prefer kind of something that they're able to just listen to on their own time asynchronously? I think that's going to really impact people's experience and the positivity that they have with any outreach efforts. I mean, really trying to target it directly to each individual. And that goes for anyone, regardless of whether or not they have special needs. But I think that's a community that can benefit in some really discrete ways from just a little bit of careful thought and planning.
Yeah, I absolutely second that. I would have simply said that it absolutely depends on the individual, and it depends on their personality, their characteristics, and their special needs. I would say that there's some research that suggests that tactile technology is really effective for people who are on the autism spectrum. And so the idea that you might be using an app where you can video conference, but you can move around the squares in which you're talking to people on, which is something you cannot really do on Zoom, but that there's this tactile component can be really effective in engaging individuals with that particular technology. Things like eye contact that can be distressing for somebody on the autism spectrum actually is easier to engage in something like an online video conference than it would be in face-to-face. And so there, absolutely, I would say there are a lot of different things that you would have to consider, both about someone's special needs and about just their general personality and characteristics that would lend you to one particular technology over the other. I would also simply mention that there are several, I wouldn't say a vast number, but there are several really well-designed apps that are specifically for people who have various special needs in terms of communication and in terms of engagement online. And I could absolutely send some of those to the individual who has the question. If they wanted me to, you can tweet at me. But it's actually an area of research within media effects that's been garnering more attention, and that is how individuals with special needs use technology.
Thank you. It looks like we're running out of time, so I would like to close this by asking you a lighthearted question. Do you have a parasocial relationship, or someone, or yeah, who do you have a parasocial relationship with?
Yeah. Do you want me to go first, Brad?
Sure.
Okay, so there is a British comedian named Greg Davies, and he is so funny. I mean, he's so funny. He is just a big goofball. He reminds me a lot of me, and so I just feel like we're buddies. And so I would say he's my parasocial relationship. He's on a lot of comedies. He's done a lot of comedy tours, but my favorite thing that he's doing right now is he is doing like this game show called Taskmaster, but at home. So he's getting people across the UK and the United States to do tasks, film them, and then send them into YouTube. And they're super funny. and they're kind of a way to like be lighthearted, and that's kind of real time. They're coming out every couple days, so I really feel like my buddy is sending me stuff there. And as a quick aside, I think if you have younger kids, have them watch Diary of a Future President on Disney Plus. It's I think there are some characters on there that I would really recommend that kids make parasocial connections with. They're super cool.
I love that to make that recommendation, you have had to have watched Diary of a Future President on Disney Plus. I love that that's the case. I have so many. It's why I think I study this. I think that I was very much raised by media, and so I have a fascination by this concept. But the one that is most interesting to mention is the character Cam from Modern Family, who was a character on a television situational comedy. And I always felt a connection to him. And in one episode, he actually showed up to his in-laws' home in a University of Illinois football jersey, where he had played football. And this is a very large, flamboyant gay character. So it was kind of a character arc to show that he played football in college. But also that is my alma mater. And so in turn, and the research suggests, right, that characters that we identify with, that we feel we have connection with, we strengthen those connections with. And that absolutely strengthened my connection to him, because I thought, see, we would have been friends. We went to the same college. And that show recently ended after a 12-year run on ABC. And I put off watching the final episode for weeks because I knew, right, that was the last self-disclosure that I would have from those characters. And you don't want your relationships to end, that your positive relationships to end. And so in turn, right, like I just kept putting off watching that episode in hopes that it would just maintain my relationship with Cam. Eventually, you have to watch the last episode. So that is a good example of one of my many parasocial relationships.
Thank you. Well, we are out of time, so I would like to thank both of you, our speakers, Jonathan and Brad, and our audience for joining us. And Brad has given us his Twitter handle at Bradley J. Bond and his research website address, which we can definitely share in the chat. And if you feel like your questions were not read, please feel free to contact Brad through Twitter. We will also return next week with political science professor Del Dixon, who will talk about how the novel coronavirus might result in a healthier democracy. Thank you so much again, and we hope to see you next Wednesday. Goodbye.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.